Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
How's everybody doing?
Good.
Everybody's good? Woohoo, I like that. It's Monday. We're trying to get it together. The week just started. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all of the continued participants of our speaker series this year. We've had some amazing speakers, and today, sheets are on the table over there. Please make sure you sign in. If you do not see your name, please write it on one of the backs of the sheets. Also, our surveys are there that we'll give out later on. Please make sure, tell us how we're doing so we know whether or not we should continue on this path. Today's speaker, well, number one is Black History Month. And, you know, I already find problems with that in itself, but I'm not going to go there. He's going to tell us a little bit more about that. But today's speaker is near and dear to me. Not only is he a personal friend, but he is a renowned scholar who hails from Baltimore, Maryland.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dr. Brice is currently professor of sociology at College, and he's one of the many amazing men that I know and learn from consistently. He's going to hit us over the head with some facts, then he's going to hit you over the head and get you into your feelings, and then he's going to open it up so you can gain some clarity into his insight with a little bit of Q&A after. I ask that everyone please really stay engaged in the discussion that we're going to have today. If you need to step out, please do so quietly. I ask that as you're sitting at your tables and you're engaging deeply in this work, that you really speak some truth. And if you don't understand something, say you don't understand and gain some clarity. We are all here as a learner. And today is no different than any of the other speaker series that we've had. So with that, I thank you for being here, and I welcome Dr. Brice.
Thanks, sis. How y'all doing? Good, good. Thanks for having me. I made it through 405. All right. She was like, can you come speak? I'm like, Bellevue? 405, around 2, 3. But I'd do anything for Krishana. Krishana, thanks for having me. Yeah. Thank you. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, the title, Avoiding Sociolexia, what it is, put race in a social historical context. Have some discussions. I got some, short videos I like to show. Got some things for y'all to discuss at y'all tables, and we'll proceed from there. Sound good? All right. So first off, I got the term sociolexia from Teaching What Really Happens by James Loewen. If you don't know Loewen's work, get Loewen's work. If you teach kids, read Loewen's work, right? The first book of his that I was exposed to was Lies My Teacher Told Me, right? All the things American history textbooks, got wrong. And so this is one that's just for educators, right? Teaching What Really Happens is for educators. And what I like about this book is he says, students can handle it. It's the adults that freak out around difficult, topics. Students can handle it. Teach them, right? He even teaches students as young as elementary school about, like lynching and, things like that. He'll show them pictures. What is going on here? And he was like, they can tell you that something unfair is going on there, that something wrong is there. And then you have sort of inroads to then discuss that with them, right? So sociolexia is this inability to connect past events to what's happening currently, right? That's what sociolexia is. And he says most students suffer from, sociolexia. He also argues that this is the reason why most students hate history, right? Because history is taught at these isolated events that happened way back then, and they usually never make connections to how that's relevant to students today, right? So students are like, why are we learning this? Right? Why are we learning this? So that's what, sociolexia is. And a lot of people have it, not just, students. Adults have sociolexia too, which is, I'm guessing, why we're having this conversation today. All right? This is Maurice Ashley. We got any chess players in here? Yay! We got one? All right. I'm no chess aficionado, right? But I liked his, TED Talk, so I'll show it because he explains how chess players actually go about problem solving. Right? And it's different from, the way that you think they go about problem solving. And so I'm going to make the argument that the way that he's talking about solving, chess problems, we could use to solve a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about today and, why people don't know the things that they know. So let's start with that. All right, where's the value?
Did this work when we tested it?
Yeah, it was on. Let me check the computer. Something. Come.
Hit that. Oh no, that's good. That's all I had. Sorry.
It might work.
Nope.
Where's it at? I put my mic to it.
318 billion ways.
Where's it coming out of?
That'd be cool if I could pull that off, but grandmasters just can't. It's too much. So we use different techniques to be able to look ahead.
And some of these techniques include
There we go.
chunking, which means taking a group.
Thank you.
There is a myth that grandmasters can see 10, 15, 20 moves ahead. And it's a great myth because I'm a grandmaster and it makes me look like a super freaking genius. But the truth is, in just the first 4 moves, there are 318 billion ways you could play. Now, that'd be cool if I could pull that off, but grandmasters just can't. It's too much. So we use different techniques to be able to look ahead. And some of these techniques include chunking, which means taking a group of a chess position and seeing what possibilities can come from just that group, or pattern recognition, which is going over a lot of positions that look very similarly and extrapolate and choose from that. The stepping stone method, which is to take a position, freeze it in your mind, and go from there to guess the next position. But one of my favorites that I love to solve these kind of chess puzzles is called retrograde analysis. And what you do with retrograde analysis is that in order to look ahead, it pays to look backwards. Now, why is this so useful? Well, in chess, it's a very complicated case. You've got all these chess pieces, it's 32 pieces, but after 5 moves, the position starts to evolve a little bit, and then the game starts to go on, and you see the chess position get a little simpler, and a little bit simpler, and less pieces on the board, until finally, in this case, a game that I played in a tournament in Foxwoods, it gets to something like this. When great players play, it often gets to something like this. You don't see like some easy early checkmate, grandmaster see through all that stuff. What you see is some end game, something really, really simple. And we like to study things like this, grandmasters do, so that if we get to them, we know how to play them cold, but also so that we can steer the position that's in front of us, the more complex ones you saw earlier, to something this easy, something this simple. So in this way, when you're dead, I already knew like 10 moves ago, because I knew where we were going. Now, why is this so effective? Well, it's something about the human mind, the problem with the human mind. We're very logical creatures. So I want you to play along with me a few games. Take a look at this sentence. Now, most of you read the sentence the second time around and realize that you missed the word the first time around. Your mind is very logical, it proceeds forward, it just ignores anything that breaks with this logical stream, and so you don't see the word the first time, the second the first time you read it. But if you read this sentence backwards, you would automatically catch it. You'd go backwards and then you get to brain, you get to then you say, whoa, there are 2 thes in the sentence. This is a really cool trick for proofreading papers. You know, you're writing a paper and then there's like these silly mistakes. Why are these mistakes in my paper? You read it backwards, you'll catch all of them. All right, let's go on to this problem, an interesting problem. Bacteria that double every 24 hours fill a lake it has infested after precisely 60 days. On what day was the lake half full? Now, a lot of people see this problem, they think 30, like, you split it in half. Well, that's not the right answer. And also, people might want to calculate, it's too big, it's math, it's boring, I don't want to do that either. But if you do this problem backwards, you get the answer right away. What's the answer? 59, obviously. You start at the end, you go backwards, it's like, oh yeah, it's half full. The answer is 59. Here's another puzzle, a little bit more complicated. You have 6 numbers, 1 through 6. The cards are face down. You and I are going to pick a card. You pick a card and you look at it, it says the number 2. I look at my card, I think about it for a minute, and I say, I want to trade. The reason I want to trade, we're going to trade to see who has the highest number at the end. Do you trade with me? Most people say, of course, I got a 2, 2 sucks. The 4 numbers higher, probability says, I'm going to do better. Wrong answer, you're playing a grandmaster. You start from the back and you work it out. If I had the number 6, would I offer to trade? Of course not, I'm not dumb. What about the number 5? Probably not either, because you're not going to say yes if you have a 6. Well, if 5 is not going to trade and 6 is not going to trade, 4 is going to be like, I'm not trading either because 5 and 6 don't trade. So you see what happens as we work backward. 3 is going to realize 4, 5, and 6, they don't trade. So the offer is definitely a 1, and all of you who said yes, thanks for your money. So this retrograde analysis is used in different places. It's used to prove intoxications hours after an alleged DUI by Pennsylvania police officers, which is kind of cool. Well, it means don't drink and drive. The use of retroanalysis is used in law, science, medicine, insurance, stock market, politics, career planning. But I find its use to be a more interesting place. Maybe one of the most interesting uses is in this movie, which I know a lot of you know, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, where Brad Pitt plays a guy who's living his life backwards. And what this movie makes me think of is that great quote that quote you often hear from people who are older, that youth is wasted on the young. Well, if you can see the end game, your youth will not be wasted on you. Thank you very much.
All right, so that's Maurice Ashley. And so I like to use this retrograde analysis when we talk about, race in the United States. So a lot of stuff that I'm going to present, we're going to start with the current thing and we're going to work backwards. And I'm going to show you all the historical connections to why this stuff is, problematic, currently. Make sense? Yeah. All right. So let's start with, race, what it is. A lot of people have no idea what it is, right? Even though a lot of people got an opinion about it and like to talk about it. All right. So one, it's a fairly recent phenomenon, which a lot of people don't know. We talking late 1600s, early 1700s. As long as human beings have been on this planet, race only came about late 1600s, early 1700s. We'll get into why it came about during that time period in a little bit. Secondly, it's what we call a social historical construct, right? I'm a sociologist, right? So there's zero biological validity to race. But that doesn't mean it's not real socially, that there aren't real social implications to race, right? Can y'all hold those two things? Not real biologically, but socially very real and have very real ramifications, all right? So this is a book, Racism Without Races, by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. And it's a lengthy quote, but it, does a really good job of explaining why race was formed and how it, still currently plays out. When race emerged in human history, it formed a social structure, a racialized social system that awarded systemic privileges to Europeans, the people who became white, over non-Europeans, the people who became non-white. Racialized social systems, or white supremacy for short, became global and affected all societies where Europeans extended their reach, right? So you start to see the justifications and the ramifications for, racial classifications. If Europe was exploring and, colonizing and enslaving the rest of the world, you need a justification for that behavior, right? Because at the end of the day, you're still presenting yourself as being, the most moral people. So how do you justify this immoral treatment that you're giving to, other folks, right? Thus, the creation of racial categories, which says they're not even really people, right? The American Anthropological Association also, issued their statement in '98, on race. The same, sort of thing. So I just, like to show this to folks so they know it's not, my personal opinion on race. Right? Historical research has shown that the idea of race has always carried more meanings than mere physical differences. That would be the social construction part. Indeed, physical variations in the human species have no meaning except the social ones that humans put on them. Today, scholars in many fields argue that race, as it is understood in the United States of America, was a social mechanism invented during the 18th century to refer to those populations brought together in colonial America. The English and other European settlers, the conquered Indian peoples, and those people of Africa brought in to provide slave labor. So, in the United States, once again, you see the racial formation and the racial justification for why, race was formed. Anybody ever heard of Ashley Montague? He's an anthropologist. He argued that race is the phlogiston of our time. We got any science, folks out there? What's phlogiston? We got no science teachers out there? Phlogiston is what scientists thought, oxygen was that caused, things to combust before they had a word for oxygen, right? So it was a totally made up term that all scientists believed in, right? So what then is Montague arguing about race? Totally made up term, right? That has a lot of scientific, sort of backing and, buying in. Here goes some of the early race theorists. Linnaeus, he was a Swedish botanist. Cuvier was a naturalist, botanist. Then you got Blumenbach in Germany. They were in, Swedish and, French. Blumenbach was in Germany. Anything you notice about early race theorists? Yeah, white men. Go figure, all right? So when you start to talk about that racial hierarchy that was created, no wonder why that, hierarchy was created the way it was. And then you have these guys coming in giving us scientific justification for it. So, at your tables, explain to a partner what your daily routine looks like. Like, what do you do on a daily basis? Wake up, hopefully brush your teeth. All right, you might shower. All right, what does your daily routine look like? Give y'all like 5 minutes. Seems like tables are winding down. So I have a follow-up for you. Explain to a partner what your daily routine would look like if you were another race. You choose the race and explain how you think your daily routine will play out if you were another race. All right, like 30 seconds. So I'm a sociologist, so I can't help but to observe human behavior. Right, did y'all notice anything about the second question when I asked y'all to discuss it? The room got real quiet, didn't it? Right? You thought I would have asked for like your social security number or something. I didn't. Did anybody want to share? What race did you pick and how would your daily activities differ? Sure.
I said that, like, I talked about my routine with my two sons. Talked about my routine with my two teenage sons getting out the door in the morning.
Yeah.
And, knowing what I know about our schools in BSD and knowing what I know about systemic issues within criminal justice,
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine that there would be a piece added in the dialogue between me and my sons about how to navigate those systems and
Yeah.
what to do as a evolution. That'd be safe.
Absolutely.
That I don't have to have with my kids.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, anybody else?
So I would just say in the first question we talked about, it was a very superficial conversation.
Yeah.
We get up, we go to the bathroom,
Right.
we do our morning routine, and then when you had to think about like, because I identify as Latina, but I know
Yeah.
that I'm right passing.
Right.
And so we just talked about if I showed up to a different race, this idea of like how I would, the reactions that I would get.
Yeah.
Like as a teacher in the classroom, for my community, for my students, would my authority and agency still be as accepted as it is?
Yep.
And then certainly, because I work with children, I don't get questioned in the same way that I might if I were working with adults. And certainly if I showed up visibly differently than how I identify, how other people identify me, certainly. Like I said, white passing privilege. So I don't deal with these things that I might if I were of a different race.
Got you. Yeah, thank you. Anybody else?
Well, we both like to wake up at like 5 o'clock in the morning and work out, and
Oof.
just talking about going to the gym in the morning, and I said, well, I'm pretty much usually like the only Asian person in my mostly white neighborhood going to these classes, but if I was a different race, maybe, I don't know. I mean, I know I have privilege as an Asian person too, so I don't know what that experience would be like, and just driving and not being worried about my safety as much.
Yeah. Y'all want it back, Chris? Yeah.
At first, it was really hard to think about in my context. I was thinking about, I brought my son up at preschool, and I'm one of the only white parents at preschool, and the teacher always talks to me in the morning. And they're busy with lots of kids at the private preschool, but she always greets me, always says something about my child, and I notice that she doesn't talk to the other parents in the same way. And, I mean, as frequently, I'm not there all the time, but I know that I always get greeting other parents.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. You know, really the goal of that activity was to show you like the salience of, race, right? Some people don't have to think about it. Some of us think about it all the damn time, right? That was part of the journey coming out 405. It ain't just navigating the traffic. It's also like, damn, I hope I make it, all right? Hope I make it. Because those of us that's been pulled over, we know how easily that can escalate, right? From a simple question like get out of your car, you're like, man, why? Right? Because you know where things can go from there. So with that in mind, as we shift to talking about African Americans or black people, specifically, right? I always think about, sort of this Jeopardy thing about how few or how little people know about, African Americans and African American history. As you can see, all of the categories have been answered. You can't see one of the categories is Kiwi fauna. I kid you not. That's one of the categories. They emptied that category before they even touched African American history. That's what that category is, by the way. That's African American history. Kiwi fauna. I had to look up fauna, I ain't gonna lie. It's like, man, what is it? I got a PhD, I ain't never ran across this word. Okay. All right. But with this in mind, right, there's some real damaging effects of people not knowing about African American history. People make assumptions, people have no idea the historical connections to, why things are the way that they are today. People say we're complaining, right? But if you had an understanding of this historical context, you might think about us a little differently, all right? But yeah, these are the best and the brightest. That's college Jeopardy right there, Right? None of them wanted to touch the 400 category of African American history. Right? That was probably something easy, like who wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. They ain't even want to touch that. And so it leads to, you know, things like this, right? People like slavery wasn't that bad. Slaves were happy. This was an actual book that they had to take off the shelves. Talk about how George Washington's slaves was happy to, you know, cook him his, you know, cakes on his birthday. All right, they had to remove it. Talking about how happy, you know, the slaves were doing this for him, how they enjoyed their servitude, right? But, you know, not understanding history can lead to these kind of, you know, myths, and people, you know, believe them. So how do we get here? That's triangle trade, right? African enslavement, right? We were just, you know, talking about, you know, getting our DNA reports done, right? Trying to figure out, you know, mine was surprising. My kids got a kick out of it because I kept telling them I was like 99% African. I'm like a quarter European. All right. I had to keep looking at it. I turned it to the side. Like, these can't be my results, right? But if you think about, you know, African enslavement and the slave trade, and you think about the brutalities that came along with that, you see why you have to have a justification for, you know, racial classification, right? You come, you take in large quantities of people from, you know, their homeland, and you put them in what was called tight packers, so ships that was, you know, made to carry 200, they would end up putting 400, you know, people in there, right? Laying in each other's menstrual flow, excrement, right? And you think about just that, you know, whole process of, you know, from Europe to Africa to South America, North America, you know, back. Also, one of the things that Loewen points out, and Liza, my teacher, told me, is probably the first slave trader was Christopher Columbus, right? Because then they had the route to sail, you know. Not to mention Columbus didn't find what he was looking for, so he ended up bringing back, you know, indigenous folks to work, right? So I always like to start with education, since it's an educational facility, a bunch of educators in the room. All right, I love Steve Biko's quote. Right, he was a, you know, South African freedom fighter. The greatest weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Right, when you think about our school system, think about what people are and are not getting, right, in terms of their own history and how that shows up in terms of their grades, performance, so on and so forth, motivation. Right, I always, you know, revert back to Biko's quote. Anybody ever read this book, Multiplications for White People? Lisa Delpit? All right, it's a good read. She has a section in there where she talks about the so-called, you know, achievement gap. And the research is very clear on the so-called, you know, achievement gap. There is no achievement gap at birth. Achievement gap starts round about at 5 years old. What happens around about that age? School, right? Duh. So what the research is actually showing is that Africans and African Americans actually develop faster and outperform their white counterparts up to that point. Right? They say even in cases of malnutrition, they tend to outperform their white counterparts, right, up to that point. So once they hit school, that's when you start to see, you know, what we call the achievement gap. Right? Don't worry, if y'all, I can send y'all the, you know, the slide deck and all that stuff. Make sure you get it. So when you look at, you know, Washington, right, if you want to talk about our achievement gap, this is, you know, a comparison of teachers to students, right, by race. All right, so you see the students that tend to do best in the state of Washington also happen to have the most teachers that tend to look like them and come from their, you know, same cultural background. I always tell people that's not by mistake, right? You learn better from folks that, you know, tend to understand your cultural context, tend to teach things that you see as relevant, so on and so forth. So you see, you know, the numbers and the data. Then I'll even personalize it for you. That's my first grade class. You can't find me. Don't stop trying to look, right? I'm up there. That was me when I was in first grade. So I grew up in Baltimore, like, you know, people say it. Whenever I show this to my students, they're like, damn, that's a bunch of black people. I'm like, yeah, man, I grew up around black people. Right? I know that might be a foreign experience for you. Right? Grew up around a bunch of black people. Right? But what disparity do you see? Who's the head teacher? Who do you think Mrs. Schwartz is? Yeah. So, you know, all these black students, can y'all see the name of the school? Yeah, Rosa Parks School. It was a Catholic charities, you know, school. That was the reason I got to go. We were broke, right? But they gave our parents a sliding scale, you know, payment plan. So I was able to go, you know, to Rosa Parks, you know, elementary school, which was named after Rosa Parks, right? But still, when you think about the curriculum and the type of education I got, do you think it was very, you know, Eurocentric or Afrocentric? It was very Eurocentric, right? Very Eurocentric. So let's look at this, you know, doing that retrograde analysis. Let's go back and look at some connections to higher ed and what some, you know, people throughout history have had to say about black folks, right? So this is David Hume. You probably get him if you ever take a philosophy class. They probably won't tell you this part of David Hume, right? Like most majors. So I tell my students all of the time, they hired me to teach white sociology. They were sadly mistaken, right? But that's what they hired me to teach. My students get a whole lot of other stuff, right? To the point sometimes they make them uncomfortable. I'm like, deal with it. Right? You know how many times students of color got to sit through lessons that don't relate to them? Deal with it. Right? So this is Hume, right? He says, I am apt to suspect the Negro to be naturally inferior to the white. Once again, you can see that, you know, racialized hierarchy, right, that they were talking about. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation, no ingenious manufactures amongst them, no arts or sciences. Right? Think about the deep denial that one has to be in when you think about like the Egyptians and so on and so forth. Think about the level of, you know, disassociation you would have to be in to, you know, start developing and advancing these theories. Right? Then Arnold Toynbee, who's a historian, when we classify mankind by color, the only one of the primary races which has not made a creative contribution to any of our 21 civilizations is that of the black race. All right? So you see this, you know, hierarchy again, this natural inferiority that they talk about. So more recently, this is Linda Goffreson, right? She's a psychologist. We now have out there what I call egalitarian fiction, that all racial groups are equal in intelligence. All right? We have social policy based on that fiction. For example, the 1991 Civil Rights Act, which said that if you have disproportionate hiring by race, that's prima facie evidence of racial discrimination. Differences in intelligence have real world effects, whether we think they are or not. Right? So talking about the racial differences in intelligence. And then probably one of the worst, or my favorites, however you want to, you know, spin it. You know, William Bennett, former Secretary of Education, if you want to, you know, reduce crime, he was quoting, you know, a book called Freakonomics. It was talking about, you know, aborting, you know, black folks in order to lower the crime rate. All right? If you want to reduce crime, you could. If that were your sole purpose, you could abort every black baby in this country and your crime rate would go down. That's the former Secretary of Education. Right? So when we talk about these things being embedded into institutional practices, these are the folks in some of the highest offices of this country, right, that have these, you know, sort of thought processes or ideologies around race. Right? And then James Watson, right? I'm gloomy about the prospect of Africa. Our social policies are based on the fact their intelligence is the same as ours, whereas all testing says not really. All right? So Africans and people of African descent, not really as intelligent as us. All right? And so this is the kind of stuff I tell my students, right? I give them all this stuff. I don't believe in holding stuff back from my students. So this was end of the quarter, you know, presentation that a student was giving. And I always tell people, man, your students listen to you if you make this stuff relevant to them, right? So he was doing something on environmental racism. And he was talking about the closing of public schools in, you know, cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, right, so on and so forth. And, you know, he remembered the quote, you know, that I said, y'all got to remember I teach adults, right? Right? Can you bleep it out while you streaming? I skip it then. It says, you know, as Dr. Brice said, they closed 50 schools in Chicago. That's effing ridiculous, right? And he's right. That's exactly what I said. Right? But he had a much, you know, larger structural context. But the point is that if you give students what they need, you give students, you know, an opportunity to talk about their personal experiences and things that's important to them, man, they retain stuff and they listen. You know, your students hear you. Your students listen to you. And then I love this quote by Malcolm, right? Only a fool would let his enemy educate his children. All right? That's a deep, deep analysis that I'll just let, you know, sit with you. So what are some structural barriers, right? Why are we still talking about all this stuff, you know, present day? Y'all remember Kaepernick? All right? Okay. This is how crazy race is, right? So Kaepernick clearly stated why he took a knee. Why did he take a knee? Protest police brutality. And it became anything but that, right? And in fact, when the conversation come up, nobody ever mentions police brutality, ever. right? You disrespecting the flag, right? It's all kinds of other, you hate soldiers. Like, man, how do you make that connection, right? He started kneeling because he met with a soldier and said, you know, this is one of the ways that I can be, still have my protest and be respectful, right? So why, would Kaepernick, do something like this? Start with retrograde analysis, you start to learn that he ain't the first, right? We've always had athletes that were willing to, step up. That's me and John Carlos. He placed third in the '68 Olympics, right? And this was, him and Tommy Smith's, protests, right? They threw that up to protest the conditions of blacks, in the United States. They almost boycotted, the whole Olympics, because this was after Dr. King got assassinated. They almost boycotted the whole Olympics. And I always ask people, what's the Olympics in terms of the U.S. team with no black athletes? Right? When nobody tuned in. Nobody would watch, right? But this is their protest, and this is what they did. This followed them for 40 years. They got back and couldn't get jobs coaching track. They were Olympic medalists and couldn't get jobs coaching track. His first wife killed herself, right? Because they was chopping up furniture in order to put into the fire to, keep their kids warm, because the FBI made sure that they didn't get jobs when they got back, right? 40 years that harassment, hung over his head. He was like, I'm just now coming out of that funk, right? From all of the stuff that the U.S., did simply because, we did this. How dare us be athletes and use our platform to protest, something unjust back home, all right? So when you think about that story, it mirrors Colin Kaepernick's, right? He prayed the ultimate sacrifice. Did Kaepernick have a job last season? Nope. They got quarterbacks that was retired before they, asked him to come in. They were pulling people who had a broadcasting job. He was chilling. Cutler was home chilling. Hey, man, you want to come play for 14? Yeah, right? We're not touching Kaepernick, though. Simply for protesting police brutality, which got, flipped into a bunch of different stuff. So let's talk about some of these structural issues. This is my favorite, report. Around Dr. King's holiday, United for Fair Economy puts out these State of the Dream reports to let you know, what the gaps are in terms of, wealth and income in the United States. And I like this one because the charts in this, report were super clear. And, students love, being able to read these and dissect them. Right, so first off, you see any trends? This is median family income. White and black. 68 to 2007. Any trends? You see any trends? So it's not getting, so you hear a lot of times, right, stuff getting better. It didn't get better, it actually got worse, right? The gap widened. That ain't the first thing that caught my eye. Anything else catch your eye? Look at 68 to 2007. Look at whites' income in 68 and blacks' income in 2007. All right. Yep. And like I always tell my students, that's not, lack of individual effort. That's due to structural, right, forces at play. And we'll talk about, some of them after I show you even more disturbing chart. All right, this is net worth by race. See some differences? Right. And those are because of things like, one that we can talk about is job discrimination. A lot of y'all heard of the MIT name experiment, right? Sent out 5,000 job applications, half with white sounding names, half with black sounding names. Resumes were the same, right? From entry-level positions on up to top-level positions. The white sounding names got 50% more callbacks than the black sounding names. Same resumes. And they've replicated that study over and over again with like zip code, right? Because you can pretty much determine the race of a student from zip code, right? The high school that they went to. They've replicated it over and over again. They get the same, sort of results, right? And that's before you even get in the door. That's just based on, name, right? And y'all heard of that or, read that experiment, right? If you haven't, the name of it, the actual name of it, because my students are always like, what's black sounding names, what's white sounding names? The actual name of the study is, are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal, right? That's the actual name of the study, right? That's not the worst one. The worst one is, it was called Mark of a Criminal Record by Diva Pager. She's at Princeton now. She was at Northwestern when she did this study. So she wanted to see if having a drug arrest on your record affected your employability. What do we know? Absolutely, right? But she had the data to disaggregate it by race. So she had 4 categories: whites with a drug arrest, whites without a drug arrest, blacks with a drug arrest, blacks without a drug arrest. So who did the best in the job market based off of the MIT experiment? Whites without. Who did second best? Whites with, right? Whites with a drug arrest actually fared better in the job market than blacks without, all right? So, like I said, these studies been replicated, over and over again. Another way you can think about the lack of, sort of money by net worth is housing, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is a really good book by Becky Pettit. She's a professor at UW. She came to Highline to speak. And what she's basically arguing is the data that I showed y'all is actually probably worse than that, because that's census level data, right? Meaning you had to have a household or be in a household. That don't, count people that's incarcerated. So when you think about the numbers of black folks that's incarcerated, that those disparities and those gaps are probably even bigger than that if you were somehow able to add them in, right? Especially if you think about, their income or lack thereof. We ain't talking about, we talk about minus income, because folks usually got to put money on their books, right, to maintain them while they're in prison. So we ain't talking about, even a little bit of income. We talking about minus, income. So the data is probably even worse than, what I showed y'all. When we talk about housing, we can then talk about redlining and blockbusting, right? So when you look at net worth, one of the ways in the United States that people were able to build their worth has been through, their houses, right? But we know that blacks have been consistently, discriminated against in the housing process. The process of redlining, people familiar with redlining? You would go in the bank, it'd be a red line drawn around, an area where you could only get a loan for if you were, black. You couldn't get a loan anywhere outside of that, area. And the problem with a neighborhood being redlined is that the property value started to tank. So that's when, whites would flee, right? And whites fled, businesses fled, right? I saw one historian say, if you want to know why there's a ghetto in every major city in the United States, it was the historical legacy of redlining. Federal government basically armed banks, with racist, policies to discriminate against, homeowners, right? So you could live in a neighborhood, you could have been a homeowner, but your value was tanking. And if you wanted to move into a neighborhood that had a higher property value, they wouldn't allow you to get the loan, right? And this is, Seattle, right? Seattle like to think that they, somehow, avoided racism, right? So I'm constantly showing my students, stuff about Seattle. So that's the 1960, that's the black population in 1960, that's the Central District, right? Don't look like that now. Right, because one of the problems with redline communities is you can't control your destiny anymore. So when they want to come take the land, they can come do that too, right? That's gentrification. You come back in and take the land. The other one was blockbusting, right? People familiar with blockbusting? Blockbusting was basically a technique that real estate agents used to scare whites to move out of the neighborhood. They would actually hire a black person to walk their dog in the neighborhood. And then they would leave flyers in, the mailboxes and say stuff like, hey, those blacks are moving in. So you know what's going to happen based off of redlining, right? You know that your property value about to tank. Don't you want to sell that house, right, for cheap and get up out of here? Right? So they would do, what was called blockbusting. And it was actually written into the code for, the real estate board manual, right, all the way up until 1956. This was actually in the code. This is how they were trained, right? Don't try to sell houses in white neighborhoods to black home buyers. All right? The code read, a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. All right? So when you think about segregated neighborhoods and how they happen, it was through these, legal bases, that they happen, right? It was encoded into the process, right? So redlining and blockbusting. What about, advertising and media, images? We done had a lot of examples of that lately, right? If y'all been, tracking this stuff, y'all been tracking this? Right, what's the messaging behind this? So that's Dove. Both of them are Dove commercials. Say that again? Yeah, any others? What other messaging do y'all see with this? Because a lot of people are like, man, ain't no problem. I don't see the problem. I heard something about dirty and clean.
Yeah, if you're clean, you're white.
Yeah.
It just reminds me of a picture I saw back in high school in my U.S. history class.
Yes.
And it was a little black kid, and the ad said the soap would make them white.
Yes.
And this just reminds me of that. And we think of ourselves as beyond that.
Yep.
And yet that's a modern man.
Absolutely. It's just another iteration. This is that retrograde analysis, right? So you're looking at these, things that we're seeing now, and you can go back and link them to the historical legacy of this kind of stuff, right? Soap ads, right? The cleaner you are, the whiter you are, right? Or you can lighten your skin, right? If you would use this soap, you can see them in, all of the ads, right? You can see her hands getting white. You can see the, kid getting white in the first picture. You can see the face of the kid, in the tub that has been cleaned, is white. So you see this, sort of messaging and, imaging, throughout media. What about this one? Y'all familiar with this one? All right. Coolest monkey in the jungle is what the sweatshirt says. All right. And a lot of people was like, oh, I don't see the problem with it. What's the problem with it? And I'm like, that's because you don't know your black history. Right? One of the ways that racial hierarchy worked, and one of the ways that they dehumanized us, was to always depict us as monkey-like or ape-like. Right? So to see something like this is just a reiteration of, that. Right? And whether people are realizing it or not. Right? You're taking it into your, your psyche. And so, yeah, I'll show you a little bit of this. This is a doctor at UCLA. Because I always tell people that, you can't dress your way out of it. You can't earn your way out of it. All right? This is all, sort of problematic. So I'll show y'all a clip to let him talk about his experience. Then I start.
Including nearly 200 faculty, staff, and professional peers. Dr. Head was subjected to the first of many overt and racially motivated acts.
This particular year, these residents got ready to do their roast, and they showed a few slides, and I started noticing that they appeared to be concentrating on me, and there was a series of close to 20 slides consecutively describing me as a poor doctor. Then the final slide was a photo of a gorilla on all fours, with my head photoshopped onto the gorilla, with a smile on my face, and a Caucasian man, completely naked, sodomizing me from behind, and my boss's head photoshopped on the person, smiling. I could feel the pressure in my chest.
Problematic, huh? All right, that was, medical school. That was, his experience, right? Did you see what they superimposed his face on? Did y'all catch that? All right, so once again, you're seeing that, ape-monkey metaphor, right, connected to, black folks. Then I'm sure y'all remember this, right? LeBron was the first black person to, pose on Vogue, to get the cover of Vogue. All right. Unbeknownst to him, he was posed in a, World War I propaganda-like pose with a, an ape holding a, white woman. So they throw Mrs. Tom Brady in his arm, and he's similarly, posed, the same way. All right. Once again, that monkey ape, sort of metaphor. That's why that, shirt is so problematic. All right. Then I'm gonna show y'all, this commercial gonna really mess y'all up. So I tell students all of the time that, this is just not a United States thing, right? In a global context, you see these problematic, sort of images. This is the clearest image I can find. That was a black toothpaste commercial. So he lays down on a bed that's like a toothbrush and becomes the black toothpaste. So when you talk about objectification or otherizing, black folks, one of the ways is to turn them into objects, all right? Not to mention him climbing a pole like a monkey, right? Grabbing a balloon. So you see this, throughout, many societies, many different, sort of contexts. And so in case I thought I was tripping, right, I'm always going back to the research, right? So I'm like, all right, I'm not tripping, right? This is an article called Not Yet Human, talking about implicit bias that, folks had about this, 8 black people metaphor. And they say that this metaphor is so persistent that even folks that didn't grow up around it still have that connection. Not only do they still have that 8, monkey metaphor, connection, but people who tend to think of blacks that way are much more likely to assign them to harsher sentences, and they write about them differently in newspapers and project them, certain ways in the media, right? So they say, not yet human. In fact, one of the studies that they mentioned in here was the California State Patrol that got in trouble because they was using a special code whenever black people were involved. It was called NHI, right? They say, right, yeah, they say, don't hurry, it's a, NHI, meaning no humans involved. If black people were involved in an accident or a shooting or California State Patrol, NHI, there's no humans involved, don't worry about it, all right? So that dehumanizing, sort of aspect. They also mentioned some cool studies in there, cool, messed up, however you want to see it. Studies about putting, fake guns in students' hands, right? And they wanted to see how likely they were to shoot, innocent people. And it was a much higher likelihood that they would, shoot unarmed black people than they would, their white counterparts, right? So they were saying that, this implicit bias is, deeply ingrained, whether people realize it, or not. And so I always say, it's not just me. Dr. King warned us about this a long time ago, right? In terms of, how folks thought about, whiteness and white supremacy and racism and how that works, right? This is Dr. King's last book, and there's a reason why most people don't know that this book exists, right? Because this is where King's really radical, views started to, come out. You start to realize why he got assassinated right at this point. It ain't that, let's hold everybody's hands, kind of stuff that y'all get around Dr. King's, birthday. It's the real, radical King. And this is a quote from one of the chapters. But most whites in America in '67, including many persons of goodwill, proceed from a premise that equality is a loose expression for improvement. White America is not even psychologically organized to close the gap. Essentially, it seeks only to make it less painful and less obvious, but in most respects to retain it. Most abrasions between Negroes and white liberals arise from this fact, right? Dr. King was laying it down. He was like not even psychologically, ready to deal with that fact to, close the gap, all right? So we living in a weird time, right? Trump is doing 2 things at once, right? On the one hand, he's garnering real racist folks, right? And on the other hand, he's totally denying the fact that he's using any kind of race-related motivation, right? These 2 things are, being held true, at the same time. And so Bonilla Silva, who I mentioned earlier, these are the 4 forms. When he coded his data, he collected over 400 interviews, and he came up with these 4 codes in terms of what he called colorblind racism, right? He was like, this is how it functions modern day. He says 1 is what he called abstract liberalism, right? So these are, whites that openly will be like, yeah, I believe in equality, right? But when you start putting those, plans into play, they're like, whoa, hold up, right? That's reverse racism, right? That's this, that's that, right? Yeah, we believe in equality. Until, right, you start taking out spots, right? That's what Derek Bell, referred to as interest convergence, that most whites are on board until it starts to affect their bottom line. All right? Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Oh, I got to do something? No, sorry. All right? The second one is naturalization, right? This is the idea that, segregation is naturally and biologically driven, that, people just like being around, people like themselves. I think I showed y'all historically in terms of, housing, why people are segregated. It wasn't because people didn't want to live, next to each other. It's because people were forced, right, to move away from each other. Right? So it's, it's not natural, but that's an easy go-to, for folks. All right? Then cultural racism, right? This cultural racism replaced what we, considered to be biological racism, right? So intellectual inferiority. So now it's cultural reasons, right? You know, blacks and Latinos just don't care about school, so there's nothing we can do for them, right? No look at the curriculum, no look and see if, you know, they're represented in it. It's just, oh, it's cultural deficiency. They just don't care about these kind of things. And then the last one is my favorite, you know, because we hear it all the damn time. The minimization of, you know, racism frame, right? Where people always like, you know, it's better now than it was in the past. And like a buddy of mine always say, if your starting point is slavery, everything is better, right? It ain't hard to be much better than African enslavement. If that's your starting point, hell yeah, we better, right? But that's a really low bar. It's a really low bar. So he says, you know, this is the way that, you know, sort of it manifests itself. I was going to show y'all a video. I don't have time. Maybe y'all can check it out when y'all get a chance. And for her, she's British, and she's been having to deal with all of the stuff in the media about, you know, the soon-to-be, you know, princess, right, about Meghan Markle, right, because all this, you know, crazy stuff has been, you know, being said, sort of that racism is coming out now, right, blah, blah, blah. And this is her sitting around with like 4 other, you know, white folks. And I promise you, they go through damn near all of those 4 racial frames in terms of their justification. Oh, no, it's not like that anymore. No, we don't see that. No, I don't see you that way when I, you know, look at you. But, you know, just Google, you know, closet racist, all right? And that'll pop up. That's been a fun activity to do. And I always end on Bobby Wright. He has a book called The Psychopathic Racial Personality. If you want to understand racism, get Psychopathic Racial Personality. You might not be happy when you read it, but it's important for you to read and hear, right, what he's, you know, talking about. He basically argues that, you know, racism is psychopathic, right? And it has to be. There's no other explanation, right, for something that's a social construct to have gone on and lasted, you know, so long. But I really like what he says about the moment of truth, right? And as educators, I always say this is, you know, something that we have to grapple with, you know, that moment of truth. He says, if you ever, you know, seen a bull fight, right? He says the bull, up until the point where it realizes that the end game is for the bull to be killed, is just a game, right? It's going at the sheep, trying to hit the sheep, playing, passing by, passing by. Then he says the bull has a moment of truth where it realizes what that interaction is really about once he sees the sword, right, that the guy, you know, is holding. And by that time, it's what? It's too late, right? So he argues for us to have a moment of truth. And if we were going to use that retrograde analysis, right, we can look at where we want to go, where we are now, and what can we do to change the trajectory of where we're going, right, versus hoping, you know, something is going to happen, right? We can actually make these things, you know, more equitable. If race is a social construct and all of the stuff I talked about is socially constructed, then it can be changed, right? That's the beauty of, you know, seeing the fallacy of biological racism, right? It's not something that's biologically fixed. It's something that's a social construct that we can do something about if we choose to. If not, then we have to make the argument that the United States is doing exactly what it was designed to do, right? Privilege certain people and oppress, you know, other groups of people. That has to be, you know, the bottom line. That has to be the conclusion. Other than that, you know, we can do something about it. So with that, there's all my information. I'll field some questions. Is that what we're doing? Q&A?
Yes.
All right. We'll do Q&A.
When you were talking about the Redlining, I remember there was something a Christian page, one of the equity specialists talking, and I pulled it up. This property shall not be sold, leased, rented, or occupied except or by persons of the Aryan race. That's Clyde Hill. These covenants were just lifted by Governor Gregoire just back in 2006. So it's a list of all of the covenants that speaks to Bellevue, that Japanese, African, Chinese, or other Mongolian descent will not be allowed to purchase. So those were still on the books until 2006 when she removed them. And that's quote for quote. That's Clyde Hill. That's up the street. So it resonated with what you were talking about then.
Yep. And if y'all want to look deeper into that, all you got to do is Google segregated Seattle. It was put on by UW. They collected all of this research. And so those racial covenants and all those things are right there on that page. You can go straight to it and read it. Yep. Then there were sundown towns. Yeah. That's a deep history. Man, people familiar with sundown towns? So sundown towns were, and they all throughout the United States. Loewen, has a book on sundown towns. He said when he looked at Illinois, he expected to find 2 or 3. He found over 200, right? And they were basically, all white towns where, people who weren't white could go work during the day, but they had to be out by sundown. And if you weren't out by sundown, whatever happened to you was your fault, right? You could be beat, you could be killed, you could be raped, and it was your fault. So yeah, law enforcement would not enforce anything after the, sun going down. And some of them had horns on the water tower. So, as the sun was setting, they'd sound the horn to let all white folks know to, to get out of town. All right, they were called sundown towns. And look, I think we had a question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
So what are the first 3 things that you would recommend for our people system to do to make really a lasting change?
So, one, if they were really serious about meeting the needs of everybody, they would make sure people that were employed had that specialized training, right? That's first and foremost. How am I asking you to do a job that I don't train you to do, right? At the, the very top. 2, barring that not happening, there are always things that, individual educators can do, right? I didn't learn this stuff in school. This is stuff that I learned on my, own. I didn't learn this stuff in school. I always give the example of, Dr. Du Bois, right? People familiar with W.B. Du Bois? Sociologist, right? How much Du Bois do you think I had to read to get a PhD in sociology? 0. He was a pioneer of American sociology, and yet was never required reading to get a PhD in the field, right? Which is a damn shame. And that's indicative of a lot of sociology programs. So, be cognizant of, what it is you teach. And, probably the third one, you can Google Jeff Duncan Andrade, but I would agree is a clip of him sitting on his porch. And somebody was asking him, so you have certain things that you have to cover. And he was like, yeah, absolutely you have certain things you have to cover. But within those certain things, you can also add some stuff, right? You got some leeway in, the time period that you cover and what it is you cover, in that time period. And he said if it's things that really has to be covered, then lead with that. Start with that at the beginning, and then you can, put some, other stuff in. But yeah, I think a lot of times the educators feel, sort of handcuffed. Like I said, I was hired to teach white sociology. That's not what I teach, all right? They wanted me to teach about dead old white men. Wasn't gonna happen. Right, so we talk about the big 3 in sociology, Marx, Weber, Durkheim. I started teaching on the big 4 because I throw Du Bois in there. Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Du Bois. Right, that was, one of the things that I, sort of decided to do. So yeah, I would say immediately, individually think about, what you can do, small doable acts. And then structurally, it would be great that, it would be required, sort of training for those kinds of things. All right, so y'all can have some support at doing it. Yeah. Sure. Yes. Sure.
It seems to me like it's like a circle, just people around and around and around.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, I think, it's one of exhaustion.
Absolutely.
You talk about the same stuff over and over, and it seems to me it doesn't matter who's president. So I think Mark, what Trump is doing, even though we say Trump, it's not necessarily Trump, it's the people.
Absolutely.
This is what they're feeling. He's the figurehead, and this is exactly what they want to do and want to say. So we can keep pointing at that, but unless we hold everybody who is in that position accountable, and instead of them always pointing a finger and talking about Trump, then maybe something maybe can be faced like this, deal with what is it really?
Yep.
Are you in it or are you not in it?
Yep.
Are you a supporter or not supporter? And then lastly, is people being quiet when injustice has been done to us?
Yep.
If they really care, if they stood up with us, then maybe something will change.
Yep.
If they just keep quiet and go, oh, well, that's nothing.
Yep. Yep. There's a really good book, the point that you just made, about the Irish, right? It's called Working Towards Whiteness. And it's by David Roediger. He's a historian at NYU, I believe. But Roediger says, that one of the things that the Irish should have done was actually they had more in common with black folks, right, when they first got here in terms of the way that they were treated. But instead of, aligning themselves with black and Latinos, what they did was they bought into, this notion of whiteness, right? And so when they got their own unions and stuff, they started excluding us, rather than including us. And so they were able to, slide in, with white folks, right? That's that, racial hierarchy. That's why you have to have a hierarchy to race. Because folks that would be natural allies then all of a sudden have something to bump up against, right, in terms of racial identity. So yeah, that's a really good read, but that's an excellent point. All right. Yes.
I just find it frustrating being in Seattle or Bellevue, this whole area, because this is an extremely white, segregated region, and people learn a lot about race. They learn how to avoid making missteps. They're not as racist as people in the South.
Right.
Here, people are just way more sophisticated about masking it.
Yeah.
So I'm tired of people telling me that they're an ally all the time and telling me, I don't know, just all sorts of things. But it's still segregated. I don't really know what I can do to to help them in their journey, but I'm not really interested in that sometimes.
Right.
What can you do?
For
Talking about race with people, it's almost exhausting for people of color to keep talking about it with white people who want to understand your story, educate their children not to be racist.
yeah.
But still, the racial division exists, geographically, and I mean, I don't see a lot of different races hanging out very much either.
Yeah.
It's just different here compared to where I'm from.
Yeah. Agreed. So one of the things I always tell people is that, as people of color, one of the things you got to do is, protect yourself, first. You're not going to feel like answering that question all of the time, nor should you have to. So, in times when you don't, it's all good, right? Don't feel like, you have to, speak up, all the time on that behalf, because you will burn out, right? It's an impossible, sort of task. And that's why we need, more anti-racist, white educators, right? To talk to their own folks. I find that to be a much more, effective model a lot of times. When I first started teaching, I had a buddy told me, he was like, look, man, I already know how you're going to teach. He's like, so you're going to need a good white source. Right? He was dead serious too. Right? So anytime white students start saying something crazy, I'm like, hold on, let me put up. Karl Marx said that. Right? And they're like, oh, right? Like, my input ain't good enough, right? And somebody, mentioned this earlier, I think, about, showing up as, especially a black male. Me and a good friend of mine, Dr. Darryl Brice, he's at the University of Cincinnati. We wrote an article that just got published called Bring the Noise, about, how, black men teach race and racism and the sort of pushback that we get, for doing it and the challenges, that we get. It'll surprise you. It might not to some, exactly, all right? A student just asked me that question, the other day, and I was like, what a student told me one time? So I was teaching American diversity, and we was talking about, images of, criminality, of black people. And she was like, well, that makes sense, because aren't, black people just more violent? I was like, huh. I was like, what's the best way to deal with this? I was like, let's run down some white history. I was like, who's responsible for the Holocaust? I was like, is that violent? She was like, yeah. All right, who's responsible for, the slaughter of indigenous folks? Is that violent? She was like, yeah. All right, who's responsible for African enslavement? Was that violence? Yeah. But that's that, pathology, right? Right? That's the way that you can demonize, a whole group and yet still see yourself as morally superior, to everybody else. Because that didn't even come into her mind when she thought about violence, right? She was thinking about, like, street crime, right? I was like, let's talk about structural crime. So, it gave her a different way to, sort of think about it. Yeah, at first I wanted to wring her neck, but I was like, all right, that's not effective. It's less effective. I got tenure, ain't much they can do to me. What else? quiet. Why y'all so quiet? Long day?
You're engaging.
Oh, thank you.
Last year, the Bell School District, through kind of grassroots movement, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we drew attention to Black Lives Matter with a campaign and the opportunity to wear buttons or shirts. And the staff at the school I was at the time actually became divided because there were, I don't know, 2 or 3, I believe all women on the staff who were married to law enforcement. And then the administrator backed down on having all the staff really embrace the Black Lives Matter movement because these women that were married to police officers or law enforcement wanted to say Blue Lives Matter, and instead of standing behind the Black Lives Matter movement in a leadership gesture, he just let the whole thing kind of, well, whatever makes you comfortable. And I'm curious to know what your response would be to keep the issue of Black Lives Matter in the forefront and not let it be sidestepped or minimized.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah. So the goal, whenever you hear All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter, the goal is always to derail, what the real problem is. That's always the goal, right? Because if they were coming at it in terms of, oh, well, my husband, not involved in those kind of practices, I always tell students all of the time, both can be true, right? We can have an issue with police brutality, and there could be some good cops out there. Like, both can be true, right? And I don't understand what the big issue is. The big issue is that thin line, that thin blue line that they talk about that you don't cross, is that you're not getting, sort of from police officers to say, hey, that's messed up, right? That's where the problem is coming in. Like, I'm a professor, right? If other professors are doing racist stuff, I'm gonna be like, yeah, that's messed up, right? But you're not getting that from, law enforcement, no matter how many videos you see, right? No matter how many non-indictments, like you're not getting that. You're not getting that. So yeah, it was a tactic that worked. The goal was to derail, right, Black Lives Matter, where that could have been an opportunity to have a real conversation. You could have brought the police officers in, right, to have conversations with people from, Black Lives Matter. Could have done that. But, people are so conflict avoidant and, scared to have those conversations. That would have been the perfect opportunity. Hey, let's talk about this. We're going to wear all Black Lives Matter stuff, bring the cops in, right? We'll have a, conversation about it. Let them know, where the staff and the students are feeling about it, and, let us get some input from, your side on it. But you see, who actually won, right, in that predicament. And that's what we, tend to see, a lot of times, right? The oppressor usually gets, to win and then write the story about it too, right, about how things occurred and how it went down. So yeah, those are really just, efforts to, sort of, derail. Early on in the Black Lives Matter, I, spoke at Bellevue and somebody asked that about, All Lives Matter. I was like, yeah, of course we know All Lives Matter. We know Blue Lives Matter. Because anytime police officer is killed, there's a parade, right? Streets are shut down. You know what I'm saying, right? You don't get no non-indictments, right? If they find out the person who shot the cop, it's dealt with, right? You're not getting that on the flip side, right? You're not getting that on the flip side. You're barely getting, any coverage of it. All right, so that's the problem I see with that situation. Yeah, and I've been pushing back on that for a long time. Yeah, because I'm like, man, y'all act like nobody else got family in law enforcement. I got tons of family in law enforcement. All right, my brother retired from corrections. His wife is a correctional officer. My niece is a correctional officer. My other niece is a police officer. And I'm still talking like this. Like, yeah, both can be true. Y'all tired. Y'all look tired. Y'all a quiet group of educators. Man, y'all thinking that's what's going on? I can smell it. Y'all brains are sizzling. Yes, we got 2. Yeah.
Mine's just a comment going back to the kneeling.
Yes.
when it first came out, and people kept saying, well, he's being disrespectful, I'm like, but you kneel to the Queen of England? How is kneeling disrespectful to the flag just because we say you're supposed to stand and put your hand on your heart? Kneeling is usually a sign of respect, so why must it be a sign of disrespect? And I just couldn't wrap my head around that. And that's where I got stuck in that issue. It's like, I know why he's kneeling and I know the issue behind it. And people keep saying, oh, well, it's being disrespectful. It's like, no, he isn't. Why are you going that direction? He isn't. He's actually being very respectful to the flag.
Yep. You know, and that's the power of, you know, race. Once again, when we talked about the salience of race, I wonder if the issue was different, would people be still having the same, you know, like if it was for, you know, underfunded schools, right, that, you know, they were taking the knee, right? If it wasn't a racialized issue, I wonder if it would be handled or seen a lot differently, right? But yeah, that's the salience of race. That's the political, you know, ramifications of race. Yeah. Yes.
I was curious to hear your professorial take on the question of where poverty fits in with race and mixed racial groups that share the same problems of poverty. The circumstance that comes to mind is like coal miners.
Yes.
How disadvantaged they become in our society, and then where does that fit into racial structures?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Probably the event that I point you to in the United States is Bacon's Rebellion, right? That's when, you know, race became really, you know, an issue in the United States. You know, what happened during Bacon's Rebellion is you had a bunch of, you know, plantation workers, indentured servants that were, you know, white. You had some indentured servants that were black. You had some, you know, slaves that were black. After Bacon's Rebellion, they said, nope, everybody that's black is a slave, right? Because they started to see how unruly that group together had become. And they were starting to push back on some of the, you know, the plantation, you know, owners on how they were treating them. And so, and this is that retrograde analysis, right? This is why it's important to understand that. So they said, nope, everybody who's black is a slave, and everybody who's a slave is black. And everybody else is some other thing, right? You have some, you know, power over, you know, that group. And so when you talk about issues of poverty, that's why I see that, you know, sort of line intersecting. There's a really good video on YouTube of the Black Panther Party, because I'm sure a lot of y'all got that rhetoric that they hated white people, blah, 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 right? Google Black Panther Party and Young Patriots. Young Patriots they basically had roots in the Appalachian Mountains, right? But the Black Panther Party was actually, you know, forming coalitions with them. And you will see in the video, they was like, man, y'all got rundown schools just like we got rundown schools in our neighborhoods. And they would start to make some of these, you know, cross-cultural connections and some of these things that, you know, this issue of poverty that they were both dealing with. But once again, that's why you have a racial stratification system. Because if you got race to lean on, then that's one of the things that can keep these groups from, you know, collectively coming together, even though they have more in common, right, than they probably do with, you know, other whites. I try to explain this to, you know, my white students all the time. I say, look, man, middle class and rich white people don't care about you, you know, no more so than they care about black people. All right, and that's the bottom line, all right? They really don't care, because you know why? Because all these years of, you know, government policies, they would have done something about poverty. It's just that simple. We do things about stuff we care about, right? That's why they're trying to get this funding for a wall. They care about that, right? That's why deportations are increasing under ICE. They care about that, right? And all politicians that claim they care about education, but yet it's constantly underfunded in many major cities. You don't care about it, right? It's just a good ploy to, you know, sound good to get you elected. Because if you cared about it, you'd do something about it, right? It's, you know, just that simple, yeah.
I'm wondering about this deportation issue.
Yes.
Also,
I think that also is another thing that people are not aware of what the ramifications are going to be, in my opinion. Yeah. Because these people that are deported left and right, especially the farming community, yep. That's our food. And these people, or this particular group, does the majority of the work. So I think we have been very short-sighted, because at the end of the day, in another year or so, when there's no food and our prices are so high, then who's going to blame who at that point? Because we're not standing up now and calling the issue what it really is.
Yeah. Yeah. And it goes against all of the historical stuff that we know, right? So historically, we had the Bracero program where they would bring folks in from Mexico and then kick their ass out after they, you know, right, yep. They would, you know, bring them in and, you know, kick them out after they was done. You saw that, you know, with the Chinese exclusion acts when after they, you know, were done with the railroad, like, man, we don't need you no more, right? Peace. So, you know, you see this throughout, but that's that retrograde analysis again that we was talking about, right? You know, had we been on our P's and Q's, we would have saw something like this, you know, coming, right? If we would have started at the end and worked backwards, we'd be like, oh yeah, that's what's coming, right? Because that's what has always, you know, sort of happened. So yeah. What else? What other questions y'all got? Y'all are quiet. I get on my class all the time for being so quiet. I'm like, man, what y'all plotting against me? What's going on? You got one in the back, Chris. Chris. Yeah, give me. I got it.
So I read about the GI Bill as a huge missed opportunity in America to really do some redistribution of wealth and access. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas of how we can try to create that opportunity again.
Yeah, so if people familiar with the GI Bill that the military get, right, for housing and school? When it first came out, one of the reasons we see all these disparities that, you know, I showed y'all is 98% went to whites. 98% of the GI Bill went to whites when it, you know, first came out. And once again, if you think the historical legacy of home ownership, what home ownership means, right? Because that gives you what, you know, Weber calls transformative assets. If you own your home, you can pull equity out, you know, send your kids to college for free so they graduate, you know, debt-free, or give them a down payment on their next home, right? You can really, you know, start to accumulate and snowball, you know, with wealth. So yeah, that would be, you know, great if we can get, you know, sort of this mass, you know, GI Bill that everybody can, you know, access and use. It would definitely help in, you know, the field of education with these prices skyrocketing, and damn sure in housing with these damn prices skyrocketing too. It's ridiculous. Can't afford to live out here these days. All right? It's like, I'm a college professor. I should be able to buy a house. But yeah, yeah. Hey. Of course.
I guess I have a comment / question.
Sure.
Is there any way you could go back to the quote from Steve Biko?
Sure.
And I guess while you're clicking, I guess my question is, how do we ensure that this idea of controlling someone's mind doesn't suppress hope for the future?
Yeah.
Because I truly feel that benefit of the doubt is really the only way forward for anyone and for all of us. So if there's been this pattern that's been set, here's the cycle that has been set in motion, I don't expect you to have the actual...
Oh, no, it's all good.
Answer.
Yeah.
It's just this idea of going forward, how can we ensure that there is hope going forward, given that there has been this message that's been set in place? How do we approach each other with benefit of the doubt?
Yeah. I think the hope piece come in, so just like we have all of these instances of, you know, structured, you know, racism, we also have instances of, you know, active resistance against it, right? So, you know, I think for me, that's where the hope, you know, always lies, is that, you know, people have always resisted, you know, this kind of stuff, and I don't plan on being any different, right? You know, what's going on is going on, and I don't want to glaze over that, right? But I also want to push back against it, you know, which is why I think I'm fortunate to, you know, be in the classroom with hundreds of students, right? Because they can, you know, get some of this stuff, and you never know how far what you teach them goes, right? There's a really good book called Tuesdays with Maury. Anybody ever read that? I make my students read it, right? It's an excellent book. So Maury has ALS, so he's dying. One of his old students comes back every Tuesday and just, you know, documents and sits down with him and get life lessons, you know, every Tuesday all the way up until he dies. And so, you know, one of the things Maury says, he said, you know, teaching is like a wave, right? You see that wave come in and you see it go out, and you never know how far that waves go. And he says, when you teach somebody something, you never know, if they teach somebody else, and then they teach somebody else, and then they teach somebody else. So, as an educator, I think we in really good, positions to sort of change some of this, language and rhetoric around, what's going on. And that's why I really like what Loewen was talking about in terms of teaching what really happens. Because if you don't teach them what really happens, then they can't really do nothing about the real problems. They think everything is okay, right? When it's clearly, not. So yeah, that's why I show them the data. I let them tease it out themselves like I did with y'all. I don't usually tell them, you see that, things are changing, it's getting bigger. I let them tease it out. I let them work through it. And then I ask them some of them questions like, you asked me, what can be done? What can we, do about this? How do you see, ways that we can push back against this kind of, oppressive behavior, right? And they usually come up with some, pretty good, answers. But the point is they have the ability to, think about that in the classroom setting, right? And expand what it is that they think they're capable of doing and what they can do and should do. So, that's kind of, the quick thing. But, it's hard, because that's dangerous. That colonizing the mind is dangerous, right? It's what Antonio Gramsci called hegemony. Hegemony is the ability to control not just by force, but by controlling one's worldview, right? Because he said, if I can control the way that you think, I don't have to force you to do anything. You'll automatically think that that's the right way to behave, right? So if I control you and, socialize you to think a certain group of people is less deserving, I don't have to force you to treat them any old way. You're going to treat them that way, because they're less deserving, right? So, we can start doing something about, that. I love to do this hegemony activity with my class. Y'all want to do it? This show you how it works? All right, everybody close their eyes. I'll make sure everybody keep their hands to themselves. All right? Close your eyes for a second. And you don't have to say it out loud. Just, think it to yourself. Tell me what comes to mind, when you hear these different things. All right, y'all ready? College professor. Astronaut, gang member, welfare recipient, dentist, bank robber. All right, open your eyes. Did y'all get certain images? That's hegemony, right? The fact that I gave you no context, I just said a word, and you got certain images. What did y'all get for college professor? You got a white male with my black ass standing in front of you. That's what I always tell my students. I usually do this like week 6. I'll be like, what'd you see? They'll be like, a white man. I'll be like, man, I've been standing in front of your ass for 6 weeks. Right? And you saw what? But that's how powerful hegemony is, right? Before you close your eyes, you was looking at me. I tell you to think of a professor, and you think of a white man. Right? That's the power of hegemony. That's exactly how it operates. What did y'all get for like gang member? Any of y'all think of Ku Klux Klan when I say gang member? Nope. All right, y'all thought about Crips and Bloods, and all right, that's hegemony. That's how it operates. That's how it works. All right? So yeah, I love doing that activity too, just to show students. All right, I start off every class with this question: how do you know what you know? And we go through this whole thing about where that information comes from. I don't start any of my classes, without asking that question: how do you know what you know? Right, so that they can see where the information comes from. And then I let them, question those sources. Could those sources be wrong? They're like, yeah, they absolutely could. Good, now we can proceed. All right, so it always sets the stage for them to, start to think outside of their little boxes. Oh. Thank you. That was fun.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brice. I appreciate you. This is a great man, great scholar.
Oh, likewise.
Thank you for educating us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And if there's anybody is there anybody in this space who doesn't know who I am? Okay, good. If you would like to deck, just email me, robersonk@bsd405.org. I'm going to tell you his deck is not for you to take and try and teach. His deck will be shared for you to be able to do your own work and your own research so you can understand where you know what you know and where it came from. So I want to just put that out there.
And y'all can email me too. Just dbrice@highline.edu.
Please fill out your surveys for me, and you can place them, you can just leave them at your table and I'll come around and collect them. And thank you for coming. I hope to see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.